I guess we'll go ahead and get started. There may be a little bit of delay after I make my announcements. We have an issue in person with the door being locked, so Scott will be back in a second after checking on that. But main announcements for those of you in the room. Afterward, there is a student lunch with Dr. Gordon in 221 in Rate Hall. So you can follow me, and this will be hosted by our CSU trainee, Isaiah Wright. You can follow all three of us back there if you want pizza and conversation with Dr. Gordon. For those of you online, make sure that you use the Q&A function to ask questions and not the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to have our CSD affiliate in the Evans School, Dr. Scott Allard, introduce our speaker.
Cool. Welcome, everybody. It's my honor to introduce you to Colin Gordon, who is the F. Wendell Miller Professor in history at the University of Iowa. As you will see, Colin has deep expertise in urban and social policy history in the US, but that expertise extends to a lot of contemporary social policy issues as well. He is a really impressive cross-disciplinary researcher with just a real deep conceptual and methodological bench that engages all kinds of different social science and public policy literatures. He is present in all kinds of professional associations and conferences. You'll see him ASA, APAM, all over the place. Today he will speak from his latest book, Patchwork, Apartheid, High Restrictions, Racial Segregation, and Urban Inequality, which came out at Russell State Press this past year. If you like this presentation, I highly recommend Citizen Brown, Race, Democracy, and Inequality in St. Louis Suburbs, which is a new Chicago book that focused on the case of Michael Brown and Ferguson, but talks about how structural policy and structural inequality create these kinds of segregated contexts in our cities and also create state violence that we observe and add in too many other cases. We're really lucky to have you today, so thanks for coming out. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Colin Gordon.
Thanks, Ron. So just share screen?
Just, yes.
It says enter new sharing key. Enter new sharing key. Just share this one.
Yep. And you type in into your CNBHDD.
CNBHDD.
Okay.
Yes.
I know I'm doing
There.
ID cards. Does your ID card work?
To start?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Scott said I'm going to talk about my new book, which is an attempt to leverage a lot of grunt work in local property records, as you see across 5 counties in the Midwest, to try and plumb, both the extent but also the impact of private restrictions on property in the first half of the 20th century. Can I get rid of this screen, the Zoom screen here?
Yes. I think if you just minimize it, you should be fine.
How do I do that?
You can click more and then closing the options. And you should be
Oh, there we go. So what I'm looking at are these private restrictions on property, which, as I'll emphasize, take a number of forms. But there's a very important sort of form of private policy in the first half of the 20th century that took the place of what we now would attribute to building codes, zoning codes, and HOA codes. But it's at a time when the constitutionality of comprehensive zoning was uncertain, when much of the housing was being built in unincorporated areas not covered by building codes. And so most of the substantive controls over private property were handled by these private contracts. And I think, you know, what I try and do in the book is a number of things. One is just looking at these agreements gives you this immense sort of archival catalog of racial restrictions and the way in which people thought about race and property in the first half of the 20th century. So in the 5 counties I'll look at, there are over 2,000 distinct agreements covering almost 200,000 parcels of property. And that includes not only, you know, all these different developers writing up these agreements, but in the city of St. Louis alone, 30,000 citizens who signed petitions to keep African Americans out of their neighborhoods. It also, as you'll see, I think this research shows just how important these restrictions were, how extensive they were. I mean, I'll come to this example in a moment, but in the suburbs west of St. Louis, as of 1950, 88% of the single-family homes were designated for Caucasians. It's virtually everything that had been built. And so we've always known that these agreements existed through legal records, but until this sort of recent body of research, we haven't had a sense of how truly extensive they are. And I think by using these records in sort of dialogue with close local histories, we're able to see racial segregation not just as a sort of distribution outcome, but as a process. How do you actually draw the lines between neighborhoods and maintain them? It's also, I think, shifts our attention away from public actors. I think the sort of Richard Rothstein color of law account of segregation in this country is fundamentally mistaken, both in terms of its timing and identifying the culpability of actors. Segregation occurs in the era of private restriction. It's not challenged. It's in some respects cemented in place by federal policies, but they don't originate. I also think, you know, we have to think carefully about what the federal agencies are doing when they arrive on the scene in the late 1930s and 1940s. What they're doing, you know, with the housing industry is what they do with all industries, and that is say, what do you need to succeed? What are your premises? What can we do? And so it's really sort of deference to market actors more than it is, you know, the sort of original racism of federal agencies. And the final point, which I'll end with, is, you know, we're looking at a private practice that was declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 1948, the Shelley versus Kramer case, and which was declared outright illegal as a practice under the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And yet we see the imprint of these policies on the ground today. And so I want to think about private restriction as a form of durable inequality. So the first challenge is the data. All of these restrictions are in local property records maintained at the county level. So there's 3,142 counties or county equivalents, all of whom have slightly different record keeping conventions. These records are only searchable by grantor and grantee. And so unless there's a legal case that identifies a particular restriction, they're very hard to find. There's a couple of exceptions to that. One is that increasingly county recorders and county assessors are digitizing their records so that they can maintain online services rather than countertop services for title companies and developers and that sort of thing. And this gives us a body of digitized records that are searchable by something other than grantor and grantee, and that we could read through very quickly. You know, the records for the city of St. Louis, for example, for 1910 to 1950 run about 5 million pages. And so you really need another strategy for going through them. Where these records aren't digitized, there are other ways of getting into them. Often the county recorders or the assessors maintain their own internal indices. And so every time a restriction is put on a piece of property, they put something in the card file. So, you know, Happy Acres has a restriction on gas stations in 1938. And this enables you to sort of do a surgical strike on the deed book, which is what you see here, in order to identify where the restrictions are. You can't go page by page in a big city and do this, because recorders' records are organized quite literally in the order that people walk in the door. And so you have these, bound volumes that are about this big. They're 650 to 700 pages, and they go sewer lien, warranty deed, quit claim, sewer lien, adoption, and a lot of them are padded by the fact that county recorders acted as sort of public notaries in the first half of the 20th century. So you have all sorts of stuff like renting a corn crib or putting a mad dog down. It's all in here with the requisite signatures. So I collected data on 5 Midwestern counties strung along what's colloquially known as the Avenue of the Saints, from St. Louis to Minneapolis. In Hennepin County, Minneapolis, this work was done by the Map Prejudice Project, where they were able to leverage the fact that Hennepin County had typewritten records from 1914 on, and that they were digitized. And so they were able to do a distant reading of them. In Blackhawk County, which is where Waterloo, Iowa was, I was fortunate to find that the racial restrictions were indexed in a separate run of miscellaneous records, so they were easy to identify. In Johnson County, where the University of Iowa is, like Hennepin, I was able to get digitized records. And in St. Louis and County and St. Louis City, which has a county status, so it maintains its own property records, I was fortunate to come across indices either kept by the county recorder and assessor, or in the case of St. Louis, kept by a local title company. Title companies go into the recorder's office all the time and sort of got sick of how badly organized the records were and kept their own record. From that, we build a database based on the source of the data, the date that the restriction is put on, whether it's done as a subdivision development or as a petition restriction, the form that it takes, how many people sign it, what the lot size is. There are all sorts of things, basic spatial information, the terms of restriction, how long does it last, and the language, like how do you describe the people you're excluding or including. All of these, sort of create this large database across these 5 counties, and then try and discern from patterns from that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the patterns, the sort of process of segregation, and then dig a little bit into this problem of durable inequality. So if we look across these counties, you can see that they vary quite widely in terms of their actual African population. What we see is that these particular new construction are just as common in areas where there's no discernible racial threat. It just becomes a common business practice, particularly for residential properties built in the 1920s. We also see that they're particularly intensely used in suburbs. So particularly in St. Louis County, which is the suburban area west of the city of St. Louis, and in the suburbs of Minneapolis. So almost half of single family homes in Minneapolis by 1950, almost 90% in St. Louis County. Importantly, they take a number of forms. And so you can have a restriction just based on the individual parcel. So if I sell my house to Scott, I can say, I'm going to sell to you, but under these conditions. You can't boil a horse to make glue in your backyard, and you can't sell to color. And that's actually a common form a restriction takes. And that's because, I have a relationship with my neighbors, and we do this for each other. But it's just one house at a time. And that was particularly common early on, like in the 1890s, 1910s. And this is what the restrictions look like. Again, echoing what you would see in a combination of sort of building code, zoning code, HOA kind of set of restrictions. More importantly, in terms of raw numbers and impact, are the subdivision restrictions, those that are put on by the original developer. These are much more ironclad legally for reasons I can go into later, but they're also much more sweeping. So, I'm going to go out into a cornfield outside the city of St. Louis. I'm building Happy Acres that has 500 houses in it, and every one of them has exactly the same set of restrictions. So you're doing it really at a substantial scale. And this is, again, an example from an early suburban restriction in St. Louis. No buildings, lots to be sold, rented, or leased. The third form, which is particularly important as well, not in terms of raw numbers, but in terms of its sort of historical impact, are what we call a petition restriction. And that's where in an established neighborhood, or in a subdivision that was built a while ago that doesn't have a racial restriction, somebody, neighborhood improvement association, or a real estate agent, goes door to door and collects signatures and says, look, the colors are coming, you need to sign in order to ensure that you and your neighbors do not do not sell. In St. Louis, the St. Louis Real Estate Board, the White Realtors Association, is a third party to all these agreements. Importantly, these are very, unlike the subdivision agreements, these are expressions of racial anxiety. They're done in neighborhoods that are about to tip. And what that means is that they're fragile and they're often fiercely contested. And virtually all of the legal history of racial restriction is about petitions, because they're badly drawn as contracts and because people want out from under them if their neighborhood starts to change. And so if we look at the type of restriction in each of these counties, the vast majority in terms of the number of parcels and the number of restrictions are these subdivisions. They're doing much of the heavy lifting of segregation. The petition restrictions, by contrast, are concentrated in areas where there's a sort of discernible racial threat. So as we'll see, these are done on the north side of St. Louis in neighborhoods that begin to tip during the first Great Migration. And they're done in Blackhawk County in Iowa in response to the influx of African-American strikebreakers in the early 20th century. But in other settings, in Hennepin County, for example, neither the Map and Prejudice Project nor I have been able to find a single petition restriction that's put on after the fact. The timing of these, I think, is quite important. And so if we look at St. Louis County, you can see these are a number of parcels on the first axis by year. And as you can see, it corresponds very closely with housing starts. And so these are done largely during the housing boom of the late 1920s, particularly the subdivision ones, right? The ones that are in orange here. There's one little petition restriction in St. Louis County. And then you see them start to take off again early in the second Great Migration. But that's, of course, aborted by Shelley versus Kramer, and they cease to become common and put on new subdivisions after that. Hennepin County looks very similar. Again, very much following the trajectory of local housing starts. Ubiquitous in the 1920s, another peak in the first hint of the second Great Migration in the early years of World War II, and then again pretty intensively after the war, right up until the Shelley decision. St. Louis City is a little more, is an interesting case because the majority of the restrictions are actually not on new construction. They're done on older construction, so all the red are petition restrictions done in older neighborhoods. And so you can see some subdivisions early on. And then the peak again in the 1940s is mostly efforts to renew the original petition restrictions. So in response to the first Great Migration, you draw up all these petitions. In response to the second, you go frantically from door to door and say, will you sign again? And most people say no. And so they're quite sort of fragmentary by that. And of course, the Shelley versus Kramer case comes out of St. Louis, and you see the practice falling off again. In Blackhawk County, you get a very different description or trajectory. This is basically a second Great Migration city, and even a late second Great Migration city like Minneapolis. But you have this spike in 1914, and that's in response to the African-American strikebreakers coming up to break a shopman strike in 1912. And in response to that, you get this massive petition, over 600 signatures on the north side of Waterloo, saying, you know, we will not sell. And so you can see how this develops sort of spatially. So I'll just run this map from the 1890s, and you can see subdivisions in the county getting restricted. Then you see this ring of petition on the north side of the city of St. Louis in response to the Great Migrations, to the point where you get the picture as of 1950. These are the municipalities. St. Louis County is very fragmented jurisdiction. Hennepin County looks similar, although very little restriction in the city itself. It's basically this ring of restriction through the south and the western suburbs. And there's very little African-American population at this time, but because it looks like this by 1955, really another set the footprint of restriction, it sort of sorts the arrivals of the second Great Migration on arrival. And then in Waterloo, again, we see this bifurcated system where you get this huge petition restriction in 1914, and then almost nothing until the beginnings of the second Great Migration, where a bunch of subdivisions are restricted. This has, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I think sort of fundamental implications for the trajectory and pattern of segregation, racial segregation in the United States. You know, just through crude correlation, you can see, you know, this is our restricted parcels in St. Louis and St. Louis County, and this is the trajectory of segregation in greater St. Louis, using enumeration districts to measure the similarity before 1950 and then census tracts thereafter. And you know, it's sort of meant to make the point that all of this dissimilarity is accomplished under the era of private restriction, and federal agencies just sort of pick it up, you know, in 1940 in that state. Minneapolis looks again roughly the same. The early segregation numbers for Minneapolis are a little shaky because they're based on very small African American populations. But more importantly than that, I think, is what I suggested at the outset is this idea of segregation as a process. So if we zoom in on the north side of St. Louis, this is the historic African American community, the Ville. And the shading here is African American population as of 1920. And again, I can just play the same from the 1890s forward. You can see a lot of parcel restrictions in blue, a few subdivisions, and then this intense effort to build the donut around the Ville, done by the real estate exchange with identical boilerplate restrictions. The red there represents 550 separate restrictive agreements. Because what the real estate exchange would do is they would go down the side of the street and say, you got a sign, you got a sign, you got a sign, you got a sign, you got a sign. And as soon as people were like, I don't know if we want a sign, they say, okay, fine, we'll file that in the city hall and start again. Because, you know, they were somewhat anxious. These had very uncertain sort of legal status. It was unclear whether the signature of the majority of people in the neighborhood bound everyone in the neighborhood. In some cases they did, in some cases they didn't. And if they did, it was unclear what threshold you had to reach. 75% had to sign, 80% had to sign. A lot of the controversy in St. Louis, including the Shelley versus Kramer case, revolved around the fact that the realtors routinely said everyone signed. And then people would say, well, everyone didn't sign, so why do I have to abide by it? And you know, the courts were, yeah, you're right, it's a pretty shitty contract. What we find again in this setting in St. Louis is that the early legal history, most of the litigation over restrictive covenants before the 1940s is brought by white homeowners who want out from under something that they or their parents had signed because the neighborhood is changing. And you know, this is no longer protecting me, it's keeping me pinned in the neighborhood. I no longer want to live. I think we can look at this, you know, this is a slightly different way. I'm just going to show year by year. So this is the Ville, where the green line is. But one thing that complicates the real estate strategy is African Americans already begun to move into this neighborhood down here. This is Delmar Street in St. Louis, which is the source of what is now called the Delmar Divide between black and white St. Louis. And this is the Shelley versus Kramer restriction, which is one of the very first on the north side of St. Louis. So that's what it looks like, you know, in 1920. But in response to the Supreme Court decision in Buchanan v. Worley, which says no racial zoning, and in response to the East St. Louis race riot in 1917, and to the beginning of the first Great Migration, the real estate exchange just goes wild on North St. Louis. They start with small restrictions. So 2 years later, it looks like this. So the payment are already there by 1922. These are the new agreements in 1922. 1923 gets more intense, 1924, and you can see them sort of saying, well, there's a hole up here, we've got to patch it in. But what's interesting is the attention they're spending down here, because they're doing these restrictions in the hope of quarantining the Ville, but then they don't know what to do here. And so they keep drawing restrictions, and then in the 1930s, they start to build along Delmar Avenue. And then systematically do it in 1934 and restrict almost all the properties on Delmar. And then they go to the city and say, what if you widen Delmar and rezone it as commercial? And then that hardens that as a sort of arterial boundary between black north and white south. So again, this idea of, you know, the restrictive covenants as a process, but also closely allied with even very small planning decisions made locally, which I'll come back to in a minute. This is Waterloo, and so here what I've done is I've charted African-American occupancy by house, and so those are the black squares, and that big petition restriction. Here again, if you look at this sort of process here, the petition restriction is quite strategic. It's to the north. They don't need to do anything to the south because there's a rail line and a river there, and they're sort of leveraging those existing hard boundaries. And they are pretty effective in keeping the African-American population sort of strung along the tracks here. Although, as you can see, the petition, which again is this expression of racial anxiety, does begin to fray by the 1950s, and African-American occupancy is scattered throughout sort of its original footprint. And the end result, is somewhat mixed. It's very difficult to draw a clean line in these settings between private restrictions before 1950 and patterns of racial segregation today. Partly because there's this big difference between the petition restrictions and the subdivisions as to their long-term impact. The petitions all fail. The failure itself does a lot of damage because, as Robert Weaver and others noted at the time, it was like Blockbuster. It's like you're holding back a dam, and then when it bursts, property values collapse, and those neighborhoods tip very quickly. So this is Waterloo today. You can see the African-American population is heavily segregated on the footprint of that original petition restriction. This is Hennepin County, where you can see, the African-American population mostly in this northeast corner of the city. And so these, again, have sort of served their role of sorting that population on arrival. And this is St. Louis, which is a very sort of uneven story because the African-American population of St. Louis, now most of which is in St. Louis County in the municipalities like Ferguson, now lives very much on the footprint of these formerly restricted properties. The difference between North County and South County in this respect is that these are mostly large lot, older subdivisions. These are first generation white flight subdivisions, and the lots are very small. So they become, what urban historians call sort of secondhand suburbs that go through another round of racial transition. And the original sort of petition restrictions that were trying to hold the line in North St. Louis have now completely disappeared. The population north of Del Mar in the city is over 97% African. This has, again, sort of disparate impact in the long run. As you can see, there are patterns of exclusion. You get pretty stark home ownership gaps in Hennepin County, Blackhawk County, and Johnson County. But in St. Louis, it's really more a story about exploitation, about the collapse of African-American housing values on that north side. And that brings me, to the last sort of substantive point I want to make, which is to tease out the ways in which this sort of spills forward to the present. How do we understand, this, what is in some respects, a curious historical episode that tails off in the late 1940s as a durable inequality? First of all, there's a pattern of emulation here. And when I say horizontal and vertical, I mean, there's a pattern of emulation at the time. Developers are imitating each other, right? It would seem to work there. We'll do it here, or they're going to national conventions and they're saying this is a good way to do it. And so you see a lot of boilerplate conventions or restrictions that are borrowed from one area and used in another. There's a lot of restrictions in Hennepin County that say no oil buildings, right? Because the developers started, they're developing somewhere else, they just use the same one everywhere. But it's also emulated by other actors, going forward. And not only emulating the practice of private restriction, but the basic assumption that African-American occupancy destroys property value becomes pretty much hardwired in private realty. And so you see, this is from a real estate, basically a real estate text from the early 1930s that was tracing land values in Chicago. And you see this sort of emulation in action because here you have this rather dry academic text. And then you come across this page where they say, well, here's the order of sort of value of racial groups when they take over property. The footnote to this, this list is the author's conversation with a realtor, with a local realtor. Like that's the evidence. And as even he argues, if enough people believe this, it becomes true and people act on it. You also see, fundamentally, and this, goes back to the sort of theories of durable inequality, patterns of adaptation. And this is, on both sides of the color line. African Americans adapt to the realities of racial restrictions under these conditions and carve up neighborhoods in ways that allow the first and second grade migrations to happen on small footprints. So the spread of these kitchenette departments in places like Chicago, carved up by local developers, in this case, by Lorraine Hansberry's father, who's largely responsible for these sorts of developments. So you have adaptations to segregation, which make those lines even harder because, now, of course, you have neighborhoods which are seen as overcrowded. They're even more of a threat to the white neighborhoods that are across the tracks or across the river. And then I think it's important, to sort of adapt this sort of Charles Tilley framework and say, well, there's emulation, but there are kinds of emulation which are more powerful than others. One of these I would characterize as leverage. That is, when you have market power, you can emulate, an original restriction in ways that are pretty powerful. And that's, of course, what the realtors do. So, one of the big answers, as to why these footprints of restriction last, into the 21st century is realtors continue to respect them. They operate as a social norm before 1950, but even afterwards, we know, even to the present day, that steering by realtors is a fundamental practice. And so, it's written into the code of ethics for the real estate industry. The realtors disseminate this practice in their national conventions. Local real estate boards are fundamental in encouraging the practice and then in sustaining it. One thing we see in St. Louis and other settings when Shelley versus Kramer is decided in 1948 is the realtors go, we didn't really rely on judicial enforcement of these anyway. There's other ways to do that. And then, a subset in terms of leverage is when you use not market power, but political power to cement these in place. And, without making too much of the HOLC, which I think, we can talk about in a minute, but certainly the FHA, local zoners, urban renewal agencies, all rely very much on the template set by private restrictions, often referring to them specifically. So if you look at the narrative descriptions of the HOLC's redlined areas, they often say this is a restricted neighborhood or protected neighborhood. And what they mean is, it has a private restriction on it that has a number of years to run. And if you look at our sort of archival record of local zoning, there's lots of records of in the St. Louis area of people going to sort of city planners and city engineers saying, shit, we can't enforce private restrictions anymore. What do we do? And they say, well, we know how to do this through zoning. And so local zoning often sort of picks this up. And so, what's notable in St. Louis is on the north side where this ring of restriction was, is that the city in bits and pieces zones what is an identical housing stock, single family housing stock as multifamily. They ensure that it's carved up so that the second great migration can sort of fit in this footprint. Whereas, these suburban restrictions on the south side are replicated, as you can see, in this pocket here, by pockets of large lot single family zoning. And then there are smaller scale planning interventions. As I mentioned earlier, Delmar Boulevard is zoned commercial, and that has the effect not only of creating a harder arterial boundary, but it ripples out into all sorts of other institutions because then you have elementary school catchment zones that don't have the kids cross this street, right? And so they face away from each other, and you have one elementary that looks north and one that looks south. And then, this Delmar is a particularly remarkable example because none of the streets go through anymore. They're blocked off by flower pots or by cul-de-sacs that break up an old grid pattern so that you have to go on a major arterial street to even get from the black neighborhood to the white neighborhood. So again, local planners, local zoning is picking up the same logic of segregation, the same set of assumptions about what makes property valuable and what constitutes a threat, and cementing that into these local practices. And you see it again in the HOLC zones, and so this is Waterloo. The description of the Waterloo zones are somewhat comical. Often these like run a page and they go on and on about housing values and transition. The description, the narrative description for this zone here is colored section. The narrative description for this one is next to colored section. And that's all they have to say in 1938. Again, the HOLC maps, I think, are better understood as a snapshot of what private interests thought at the time. They don't themselves have much causal impact, but they nicely sort of crystallize local views of.
But the red lined areas extend far past the areas that you have here for restrictions. And is that because of the racial hierarchy of those neighborhoods?
No, the racial underpinning of redlining is often exaggerated. I mean, it is true that most African American neighborhoods are red, but most redlining neighborhoods are mixed-use neighborhoods, or in the case of Waterloo, neighborhoods. And so they're trying to sort of
less desirable for other reasons.
Yeah.
But also, like, these may be neighborhoods where Catholics or Italian immigrants might, because they would have, those population suburbs would have ranked lower down on.
Right, and you see in the Hennepin County descriptions, for example, laborious efforts to distinguish between good Jews and bad Jews, in the neighborhoods. And you're right, and there's sometimes like a sort of eugenics-like list, like the one I showed earlier, saying, but they're using a lot of indicators like like mixed use, like the trajectory of property values, like the share of owner occupancy, that sort of thing, all of which are themselves racialized because, of course, one result of these private restrictions is that African Americans moving to settings like Waterloo are crowded into these mixed use neighborhoods and they become, bad as a result. And then I think, what's probably the most important element of understanding the sort of long shadow of private restrictions is what I would characterize just as inertia, right? Shelley versus Kramer comes down in 1948 and says, "Thou shalt not enforce these private restrictions." And it makes very little difference because it doesn't unbuild anything, right? And because, you not only have this like in the built environment still being respected by realtors who are showing people's houses and landlords and the like, but it's exaggerated in the built environment because you have all these planning choices, which widen streets and rezone streets, redraw school districts, all to reinforce the original segregation. And of course, as fundamental as that, as a form of inertia, is the racial welfare that results from having disparate investments in housing, both as a result of exclusion, right? You cannot get a loan and you cannot live in this neighborhood, but also as a result of exploitation, right? You can get a loan on these terms, and the neighborhood you're going to live in, the housing values are not going to appreciate. So there's this, huge housing wealth gap, which of course contributes to this moving down the line. And then finally, I would say it's important to pay attention to, the kind of thing that Kyle Crowder and others have written about is the ways in which this becomes rationalized as market forces, as about good schools and bad schools, as about crime, the way in which, there's a set of stereotypes and frames and narrative explanations of what constitute good neighborhoods and bad that don't get erased by a court decision in 48 or by federal law in 1968, and continue, again, very much to shape the way in which we think about race and property. And I'll leave it there. So I'll take questions. I'm happy to roll back to a map if you have a particular question about it. Or, yeah.
Something I was trying to figure out, one of the maps you showed, took out a section that showed the kind of subdivision or position type restrictions show habit restricted and unrestricted housing. And I was just trying to figure out, it seemed like there was a pattern between the subdivisions where almost becoming like unrestricted sections of land. And is that what you'd expect from subdivision type restrictions?
So what do you mean unrestricted?
There was like a set of different, it's like restricted, unrestricted, single family, two family.
Oh, yeah, I see. So, yeah. So the question is about the sort of the choices made by developers, like whether to restrict or not restrict. And I can't remember which map you're. Oh, okay. Yeah, so what I'm comparing here on the zoning map is the pattern of restriction, which here is in the colors coded by the kind of restriction, and here is just in the black squares. And the important thing here is what are the planning choices made to buttress that. So to buttress the petition restrictions, which are rapidly failing, the decision is to rezone as multifamily, to cram as many African American migrants into the north side of St. Louis as you can. And so the planning in this case is in some respects giving up on the restrictions. They're not working. This is our response. Where on the south side of the city, you have these sweeping single family zones which sustain the original restriction. And I think I used this example here where the zoning code is exactly the same footprint as a restriction. You see that quite common. Because, and again, this goes back to the point I made at the outset that land use zoning, comprehensive land use zoning is a questionable constitutional standing until 1926. Until then, it's considered a taking of property. You have to compensate someone if you rezone their land. So only in 1926 does the Supreme Court say, no, you can do this for the general welfare. And at that point, a city like St. Louis, its first zone plan is not prescriptive. Like it's not saying this is going to be for single family houses. They're describing what's already been built and just trying to sort of sustain it. And that's why, you have a different zoning assignation to the north side houses than you do to the south side houses. By the same token, out in St. Louis County, the vast majority of this new housing is built on unincorporated land. So it's not subject to any zoning code, even if one exists. And then what happens after the subdivision is built, then they become a municipality. They incorporate and they slap a zone plan on top of the decisions made by private developers.
On the cluster southwest section that's
Down here?
Yeah, I found that cluster translating to restrictions, which are interesting to also see that the areas that were real estate agents are typically going to say, let's petition, that all those areas that we don't restrict.
Yeah.
Just thinking of like the translates into like the way you're going to live with restrictions.
Yeah. And so the collapse or the end of restrictions on a piece of property can happen in a number of different ways. And some of it happens just by defection, like people leave and it turns and they just start to ignore the restriction. Sometimes they're actually repealed. And so in some divisions, there's actually a decision by the Board of Trustees to get rid of the restriction. But again, one fundamental thing you find with Shelley versus Kramer is there's no mechanism for removing the restrictions that exist. And so they're still there in the property records, even though, and increasingly, thanks to the effort of projects like Jim, there are addendums to the record that say this is obnoxious and it's unenforceable. But in most settings, there's not even that, right? And you still see a newspaper story once, every couple of years that says we can't sell to color. It's in our deed, right? Other questions? Scott.
So you are focusing on these communities all over the city river there. St. Louis, you had great familiarity with. Iowa, it's proximate. Minneapolis has really good records, right? So there's a nice kind of practicality with case choices. But I would love for you to articulate how those case choices can relate to these processes in other places. And especially as we think about how you really see these things kind of have a day, and then they kind of fade out. These restrictions fade out in the 50s, but they still have a presence. So in places where housing starts come much later, we see the replication of these segregated patterns. So I'd love for you to speak just how generalizable these sites are, and then also how we can think about what's happening in more contemporary housing starts and construction, and what are these kind of inertial or sticky processes continue to.
Yeah, so the question is just repeating it for the about the what this looks like in other settings, because the Midwest is unique because it's rapidly industrializing and urbanizing at this time, and it's a major target of the Great Migrations, and so there is a fundamental transformation of the built environment. It's also like a very clean racial binary. There are very few restrictions in the city of St. Louis that mention anything but colored, African, Negro. And same in most other Midwestern settings. And so a lot of it is about timing. A lot of it is about what's perceived as the local racial threat. So, the ones that Jim has found here, they're much more likely to be anti-Asian simultaneously, much more likely to be anti-Semitic restrictions in some settings on the East Coast. But it's also like it's a particular mechanism of segregation that is suited to, new suburban construction. And in settings, like Philadelphia or New York City, it's not the primary mechanism. In New York City, it's co-op boards and landlords that do the work of segregation. A colleague of mine who's trying to dig into this in Philadelphia is surprised at how few that he's finding in the city. Again, because other sort of mechanisms are doing the work. And then, of course, part of your question is, what does this look like in settings that don't really have a history of racial restriction? Because, big cities of the Southwest or something where most of the development comes much later. And there, I think, it's the institutions and the mechanisms that are shaped by private restriction and inherited from it, like zoning, very much shaped by it, which do the work in those settings, right? Exclusive, large lot, single family zoning, uses class as a proxy for race and accomplishes much of the same thing. I think one other important difference is, which is a little subtler, but it's still important, is the legal standing of these change from state to state as well. And I mean, in most states, they're sort of unquestioned because they're not intensely litigated, and people just assume that they are what they are. In the small subgroup of states, you can restrict occupancy, but you can't restrict alienation, right? You can't restrict the sale because that's understood as a violation of property rights. But the use of property, that's more like private zoning. That's okay. And state courts treat these very differently in terms of their validity as private contracts and that sort of thing. So when the case comes to the Supreme Court, it's like one from Michigan, one from Washington D.C., which is not subject to equal protection because it's not a state, and one from St. Louis. They're all very different cases that make their way to the national stage. Jim, did you ever? Oh.
Pointing out that a lot of these surges and protections coincide with the formation of registration, which makes a lot of sense. Has anyone studied, and as someone from Alabama, I realize that despite the fact that I've read about a lot of this, I don't see a lot of this explored in the South. And I know that a lot of the segregation is not baked because communities existed segregated in a segregated way long before the advent of but my question is there any research or anything known about what was going on during the wave of the Great Migration in the South in regards to these types of restricted or maybe removal of restrictions or relaxation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so, I mean, it is a northern metropolitan story in large respects, but you do see their use in so the Great Migration is a period of movement north, but more to the point, intense urbanization. And so southern cities are changing pretty dramatically at the same time. But you're right that this is the era of Jim Crow. And so there are other mechanisms for segregating. And, of course, southern settings don't have patterns of segregation that are measurable in the same way that the North do, because it's a sort of checkerboard pattern where African Americans live on the alley near houses that they might work in, and that sort of thing. And so part of it is a question of different mechanisms. You do see, there's a book, I can't remember the name, one on North Carolina about the sort of development, suburban development in rural North Carolina, where they do this quite extensively. And certainly it's most intense in border states like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland. There's also one of the other interesting sort of mechanisms that's used, and our colleague Jordy Yeager has looked at this in Charlottesville, Virginia, where you have an older footprint. You're not necessarily attaching restrictions in newer houses. So what is it that distinguishes the white neighborhoods from black neighborhoods and hardens those lines? And what he finds is that in these older settings that are built before modern infrastructure, they're coming to municipal and county jurisdictions in the early 20th century, in the 1920s especially, saying, we need a sewer, we need water, we need, we want to get off the well and the outhouse. And there's this huge disparity in which neighborhoods win those petitions and which don't. And they start hardening those lines between what are then served neighborhoods and unserved neighborhoods. Yeah, and that's not, and then it's not really until the Shaw case in the early 1960s that establishes, if you're using general revenues, you've got to serve all the neighborhoods. So again, I want to underscore a point that that I've tried to make all along. And this is a particular mechanism of racial segregation that is not unique, but particularly intense in these settings. Jim?
I'll just add, in your book, I think, and in our conversations, you said, I believe, and it certainly case in this thing, that this is a weak mechanism of segregation. It's complicated, you gotta go through it, and it's largely not necessary. So in Washington State, we find, say, on the east side, not so many restrictions. That's partly because the place is being developed later. It's also because they didn't need them. They were not allowed. It's more of sundown.
Right.
There are hundreds of communities in this state and zero black, zero Asian. They simply using social mechanisms, forensic violence, whatever, kept people out. They didn't need to go through it.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think that's a really important point, and the Carol Rose and Richard Brooks book, Saving the Neighborhood, makes the case that, these are a social norm. And that's why, given their intensity, particularly in the settings I've looked at, what's really surprising is there's not a lot of case law on these. There's a lot of states in which, there's not a case that ever makes it to an appellate or Supreme Court level. And I think, of the case law that the NAACP and others are tracing through the 1940s, most of it is in 4 or 5 states. And those are the states that end up bundled together in the Shelley case. And I don't think I've found a single substantive court case that is about subdivision-based restrictions, because they're just understood to enforce themselves, or the realtors are doing the work, or it's the move-in violence and the enforcement of social norms. Which is why you get the collective shrug at Shelley, because that's, in the end, it's not really the police that are enforcing these.
Add one other point to this. So the petition form is complicated, it's out of desperation. One of the subdivisions that are newer, the subdivider really has commercial instinct, thinking that this will add to the value. So it's not, it obviously it's doing double duty, but you could imagine some of these developers really don't care that much about the racial, white supremacy, obviously white supremacy, but they really want to increase the property value by
Yeah, yeah, but I'm struck. I mean, I won't even try to do the original prose because I'll butcher it. But Du Bois makes the point, like early in the 1920s, that it's both sort of protecting property values. I mean, you invent that idea and then you act on it, right? And it's happening all at the same time. And he says something to the effect that um, the white homeowners hate black people more than they value their own property, kind of thing. Because, and this goes, to the point, to the Robert Fogelson's book on this, which is, Bourgeois Nightmares, where he really makes the fundamental point that we need to step back and see how surprising and unusual it is for Americans to constrain their own property rights in this way. To say, I'm willing to sign something that fundamentally, shapes my ability to alienate my own property. But it's like, and then it's like a sort of HOA logic. It's like you'll do it in exchange for that kind of security.
Please.
The person is asking to outline how the federal policy picks these restrictions. You said something about deference to banks.
So about how federal policy picked up on these? Or? Yeah, so it happens in a variety of ways. And so I think the first sort of demonstration of this, which I don't think has a big sort of causal impact, is the infamous Hulk redlining maps. Because if you look at the narrative descriptions across a number of cities, it's very common for them to refer directly to either the presence or the absence of restrictions, private restrictions, as something that signals the quality of the neighborhood. So not only are they saying black people live here, so therefore it's red, but they're often saying there's a restriction here that was just signed a year ago and has 23 years to run, therefore it's green. And of course, the FHA infamously, in the wake of Shelley, or just before, but continuing through the Shelley decision, defends the use of private racial restrictions on the projects that they're financing, on the grounds that that it is this security protection, and they understand their role as sustaining market imperatives and market values, and ensuring the value of their own portfolio of loans. And so they see quite consistent with that. And that doesn't last very long in the official documentation of the FHA. And I think, the FHA people are a little taken aback at the reaction of the NAACP and others, because they don't see themselves as really contributing to the problem. They're buying into the sort of property values premise that is all around them. And I think it's not just, the mortgage subsidies, and then of course, the FHA sends signals to private lenders as well, who use versions of these maps, but also planning decisions and federal urban renewal, because a lot of what are zoned red in the 1930s and 1940s are knocked down in the 1950s and 60s for baseball stadiums and convention centers. And so there's a lot of federal money or public housing, and all of which tend to really harden lines of segregation in those settings. Yeah.
Sure. So I'm still trying to sort this out. So these restrictions are in many ways legally dubious. There's a lot of social pressure to enforce them. To what extent could or were these norms violated? Did the real estate agents do a good job of actually enforcing those social norms, or were there a lot of exceptions? And did that change over time as these restrictions got questioned?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's something I've really sort of struggled with, because I'm simultaneously trying to make the case that these were a singularly important driver of segregation, and yet maintain, Jim's view that these were pretty sloppily drawn up and easy to bail on. certainly, like if you think about the sort of micro history I did of that line in North St. Louis, there's a lot of confusion there about what they're doing. And it reaches a point where the white homeowners and the real estate agents are no longer on the same page, because the realtors want to maintain those restrictions, even if they failed on a point of principle, because we don't rewrite these. And there's a number of those petition restrictions, particularly in North St. Louis, that nobody pays pretty much attention to, because unless someone comes and says, hey, he sold to, somebody he wasn't supposed to, it often doesn't come to their attention. And so it's quite common, as in the Shelley case as early as 1911, to say, there's 6 black families living on this street. Why can't there be one more? And it's the real estate exchange who's a third party to all those agreements that bring the hammer down. Often the homeowners themselves are more than willing to sell. And there's a lot of elaborate negotiation then about where that line falls, to the point where the white Realty Association, the St. Louis Real Estate Exchange, is negotiating with the black realtors about where to draw the line. Because the black realtors are sort of trying to play both sides. We want open housing, or we just want to know where the lines are and if they could be a little bit further out, right? So they basically, that neighborhood that I pointed out that's sort of north of the Del Mar Divide but south of the Ville, they basically swap. And they say, yeah, you can have that neighborhood if we can have these lines. And then Shelley comes and the whole thing collapses. So there's just gradual, they fail under the pressure of the Great Migration. They fail as a result of the defection of people who had originally signed, were just like, I'm out of here before. They're hung on to long after they're accomplishing any purpose. One of the interesting things about the sort of legal history is the courts sort of grappling over this question of, you people signed a protective restriction to protect your interests, and now it's hurting your interests because you can't sell your house. And people make that argument, often quite successfully. And then it's also sort of very interesting in mid-1940s, when the NAACP, which is fighting this all over the country, is enormously frustrated that the only cases they're winning are these failures of contract law. Somebody signed in the wrong place, or not enough people signed. And they really want to pivot to an equal protection argument. And they grab at all kinds of things, So realtors are, licensed by the state, or isn't less recording a property deed, state action. Or, the other argument we make is not necessarily state action and equal protection, but if a contract is against public policy, right? Like the contract, if I have a contract to kill Scott, that's not a good contract, even if I pay. And so they NAACP argues during the war, because of the housing shortage, that this is against public policy. It doesn't really fly. So they're certainly aware, the NAACP is, of how weak these are, but also that they're really only making headway on the petition, the weak spot in this fabric, which is outside of settings like St. Louis, not where the damage is being done.
Thank you for all your questions. Join me in thanking Colin for his presentation.
Thank you.